you have written a book, A Deep History of Ourselves, How We Got a Conscious Brains.
The 4 billion year story
The
of how
4
we got
billion
here.
year story. And I'm going to ask you to summarize that 4 billion year story in a 2 to 3 minute answer. So maybe this is for 10 points.
Okay.
But how did we go from Luca, the last universal common ancestor, all the way to the human brain that we know
Let me
today?
tell you how I got to Luca.
Yeah.
So I was, at some point in my laboratory research, I got involved in, we'd figured out the circuitry. So the invertebrate model is once you learn the circuitry, you can then go after the molecular mechanisms. So we knew about the amygdala and the inputs and outputs and all that. So we started studying the molecular mechanisms. And so how do you do that? Well, you look for other research that has studied molecular mechanisms. The work in invertebrates, especially Candel's work, had discovered all kinds of kinases, protein kinases, that were important in learning and memory in the aplysia. This information was then used by researchers studying the hippocampus to understand long-term potentiation, and a kind of model of synaptic plasticity. And we were using the same information to try to understand molecular mechanisms of so-called fear conditioning. So that meant that something like protein kinase A and MAP kinase and things like that Kendall had implicated in learning in those invertebrates. And the same was true in mammals. So how did that happen evolutionarily? Most likely that means there was a common ancestor 630 million years ago. We know that there was a common ancestor, but the idea is that the invertebrates and vertebrates inherited the same molecular mechanisms, the same genes, and allowed us to borrow from the aplysia. Okay, so I said, okay, we're 630 million years. That's pretty old. That's a long time ago. But where did that come from? So I was digging into that and discovered that this ancestor was all of the animals we've been talking about, vertebrates and invertebrates, are called bilateral animals. They have a left and a right, a front and a back, and a top and a bottom. Before this common ancestor, which had this bilateral organization, very primitive, little brain in the front and like some neurons going to the body and stuff, but it was just basically a flatworm. And before that, we have something like jellyfish, and so there you have a diffuse nervous system. The flatworm has a nerve cord coming out of the brain going to the rest of the body. The jellyfish and others in that phylum have a relatively diffuse nervous system, no centralization. So something happened between jellyfish and this flatworm, and it all has to do with larvae, because jellyfish go through a larval phase where they're not just a big ball and all the tentacles and all of that stuff. It's just like a little kind of worm-like thing, a little larva that is swimming around. And if you look at the ancestor of the animal, it's going to be the larva, not the jellyfish. It's going to be the larval phase, because evolution and development work together. And through the early development of the body, you're dealing with the primitive baseline organism. And then as the body matures and becomes the adult, you then take on qualities that are not represented in the early larva. But it's that early larva that's connected to the genome and then becomes the basis for the extension of new animals, the arrival, the arrival of new species out of that.